Week 11 of the PhD. I'm going to keep this one quick because I'm now on my fourth attempt at doing this. I've been interrupted multiple times. One a webcam failure, and the other one was a power outage. So yeah, it's starting to feel a little cursed. Is what it is. Speaking of cursed, yes, I shaved. Yes, I regret it. Somehow I look 10 years younger and older simultaneously. Not exactly sure how that works. Whatever. So literature review continues. I know I'm going to be saying that every day and every week until August, but it is what it is. And yeah, I've been looking into the ethics side of things a lot more because it's becoming clear. Supervisor asked me to look into where he thinks my thesis fits in terms of which academic field, and it's clearly an ethics thesis. It's sort of that's the output, that's the novel contribution. I mean, yeah, we're going to be looking at AI and different. It is multidisciplinary in that context, but really the unique contribution here will be coming up with an ethical framework that um, justifies proactive in disruption of these extremist groups. So the ethics then has been a bit of a focus. I've shifted priorities accordingly. And interestingly, come across a couple of articles in this line that I think really highlight the importance of a solid understanding of ethics in this field. Now, some of you will be familiar with this based on the presentation, the kickoff presentation I did a few weeks back, as well as if you've had a look at any of the other videos in this channel, you've probably come across some ethics introduction stuff with a much younger and more enthusiastic version of me. Um, Much fatter on one occasion too, but by the by, keeping this quick, keeping it efficient. So, broadly put, from a practical point of view, there are two different schools of ethics. Yeah, there's thousands of them, obviously. From a theoretical point of view, and I'm more than happy to have those conversations, but if you're talking practical, really there's two. Deontology, a rules-based system of ethics, and consequentialism, a outcomes-based system of ethics. So, in particular, we're going to be focusing on the deontology because that seems to be the way that people are attempting to navigate the ethical problem at the core of this PhD, which is when is it justifiable to limit someone's freedom of speech? Or so, and that's exactly what this article does. The article is called Moderating Borderline Content While Respecting Fundamental Values. It's from the School of Law from Swansea University. So bear that in mind. It is the School of Law. So, of course, they take a legalistic approach to this. And it's not a criticism of this study because this is an excellent study. Fundamentally, it's talking about borderline content, does a great job of identifying that. Borderline content being extremist content that doesn't breach terms of service or any relevant laws and therefore can't be easily banned or dismissed. Instead, it's looking at stuff that promotes extremist ideas without actually crossing that line, which is, as we were aware, exactly what I'm focusing on with this PhD. Then it looks at all the various legal frameworks that may apply to that situation and attempts to find ways to navigate this. And these are all deontological frameworks. In particular, it's looking at the United Nations Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, because a lot of the time the social media platforms end up being the ones that will regulate what is and is not acceptable here. Or they are the ones that regulate that outside the law in the sense that technically speaking, they're private company, well, literally speaking, they're private companies and no one has a right to use them. They're not public infrastructure. I know they sort of are these days, and the right to internet access is sort of nominally a human right. But at the moment, the way it stands on a legalistic point of view, they're private companies, and you use them at the private company's leisure and agreement, which means they're completely able legally to just kick you off the platform at any time. However, from a rights-based perspective, this does have implications. And so the UNGP, or the Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, are a very useful way of attempting to navigate this. However, what we notice when we go through this is that it completely fails to do so. Overwhelmingly, and why I wanted to talk about the ethics this week, is that it's becoming very clear. Well, it was for me, but now it is becoming immensely clear that this is not a problem that can be solved with a deontological approach to ethics. Unfortunately, that's what we generally go to 99% of the time when it comes to solving ethical problems. Deontology, laws, rules, social norms, anything basically where it comes down to here are the rules, good, bad, reward, punish. It's simple, right? Like, well, not necessarily simple in practice, but the concept is simple. These are good things: virtues, values, social norms, behaviors, ideals, conduct, etc. These are the ones we like. These are the ones we don't. Do these, don't do these. We punish the, we reward these, we punish these, right? You get the idea. The pro of this approach is that it's very easy to communicate, very easy to communicate. Fantastic in that regard because you can codify it. You can write it down. This is good. This is bad. This is the measurement for whether you're doing it. This is the measurement. This is the consequence written down for whether for if you breach that rule. Speeding is a good one here. Like you can figure out whether you're speeding or not. You can figure out what the speed limit is. You can find out what the punishment is. You're not allowed to drive until you know all of this. And even if you somehow got on the road without knowing any of this, ignorance before the law is no excuse, and you'll just be prosecuted anyway. It's very hard to argue with any of that. You can certainly argue that maybe the speed limit should be different, but that's certainly no excuse for breaching it because, well, you had all the means available to you. You knew what the game was. You chose to break the rule. Well, you broke the rule. So the ethical standard is clear. For the purpose of this PhD, the question of when it's okay to censor speech, that comes down to the human rights framework is the most common deontological way of dealing with this. Freedom of speech is a human right. More than often than not, in most developed countries, it's codified into law. Australia, it's not. Incidentally, it's an implied right, which is interesting, but nonetheless is reasonably well protected by the courts. They're pretty proactive about it, in fairness, but either way. So, where's the problem? Makes perfect sense, right? We have the freedom of speech right. We also have other human rights like freedom to safety and political participation. Well, let's start with the problems. First and foremost, definitions. A set of rules requires a set of definitions so that you know what everyone's talking about and what you're not talking about, right? So, when it comes to freedom of speech, what's speech and what freedom? Now, those are problems that can definitely be solved and often are, but gets a little fussy because what's extremism? And when you're talking about borderline content, what is borderline content? And this is something that this article actually proactively notes is nearly impossible to define because by its nature, it's attempting to work around limitations, existing limitations on speech. It's trying to thread that needle between the language that is not permitted in this space while still promoting unethical objectives. They're still extremists, right? So, nearly impossible to define, especially because it's just going to keep moving over time. Because every time something gets banned that the extremists want to promote, they'll just switch up their language and find a way to work around the ban. I mean, some of your more nebulous ones, like 4chan, for example, take great pride in their ability to do this and attempt to co-opt everyday symbols that are otherwise used. You'll remember, for example, white extremism attempted to co-opt the OK sign. At one point, the idiots attempted to co-opt milk, seeing it as a sign of genetic superiority. Again, don't ever try and get caught up on whether or not any of this makes any sense. One thing that's also becoming clear with the extremist groups is they don't give a damn about their ideology. That's not the game. The game is power. Whether they're consistent or hypocrites or anything of the sort is completely meaningless. The only thing they care about is keeping the momentum going and getting into power. Anyway, goes a long way to explain Donald Trump, right? Anyway, so definitions are a problem. This is probably the easiest problem to solve, but it is still a problem. Second problem is worse. What if those two rights conflict? This is the problem for deontology in every capacity. All right, what if two existing rules can't be fulfilled at the same time, or fulfilling one breaches another? What do you do? Do you have a way of prioritizing the rules? Do you have a way of resolving these conflicts built into the deontology? Law typically does this very well, but when we're in an emergent space, and particularly when we're talking about things as relatively nebulous as human rights, well, which human right is more important? The free right to safety and political participation or freedom of speech? Because if that freedom of speech is being used to limit people's safety or ability to participate in politics, which one comes first and under what circumstances and on what basis? Unless this is built into the system, which oftentimes it isn't, and oftentimes can't be because it gets way too complex. I mean, if you had to think up a definition for every potential context of this and then come up with a way of resolving every single one of these conflicts, well, it's not human rights anymore, it's law. Like you've written, you're going to write a huge chunky volume on how to navigate all these intricacies, and this is exactly why the legal profession exists, right? Navigating all of the relevant case law that applies to a given situation and all the numerous complexities and seeing if it does in fact apply. Very important work, very difficult, not ethics. That's law. Worse, when you get right down to it, you have an even bigger problem to resolve here is what if there is no definition for the thing? What if there is no rule that applies to the circumstance? What if it's novel? Say, like AI and social media. Extremism, in fairness, is not a new concept, but at the same time, it manifests in new ways constantly because unlike us and, lawful abiding citizens, where then it's not bound by the rules. It is often a subversion of the rules, intentionally so. Bad faith engagement to get power, right? Like you're not actually trying to be a good person, you're trying to get power. Doesn't matter how. So if a given approach isn't working or gets stymied, you just switch up and try something different. Yeah. Much like criminals, law enforcement has to follow the law, but criminals don't. It's kind of their thing. Yeah. So if there's a gap in definitions or a gap in the regulations, then all of a sudden you're in trouble because now you've got to come up with one. Then it's got to become mainstreamed and universally accepted enough, which involves a lot of rigorous testing and so forth before it can become mainstream. And this is all because once it's codified into law, it's incredibly powerful and dangerous. So, yes, rigor is very important, and it's very important that this goes through a careful bureaucracy. However, if you're trying to respond to something as dynamic as extremists, and you're on a bit of a ticking clock like we currently are, with the US having gone down this path ahead of us and us following shortly thereafter, looking at you, Hanson, then, and Gina Runhart backing him. This is a very familiar story, isn't it? Then, yeah, we don't have that luxury. These extremist groups are recruiting and normalizing their messages online right now. If they get hold of things, we're going to get into a very nasty situation, like a nearly intolerable, well, a literally intolerable political situation, much like the US is currently doing. We can't wait. Proactivity is required. But that's not even the biggest problem. By far, the biggest problem when it comes to applying things like human rights to a situation like this is it enforced? If it isn't, it's not ethics, it's marketing. You see this all the time. Corporations, I mean, I always go with this one. The Commonwealth Bank has the best whistleblower policy I've ever read. It's excellent, truly exceptional stuff. Really, really good. They just don't follow it. There was a case study with their health insurance wing a while back that was denying claims based on saving money, not based on, they just redefined terms. What was my favorite one? Oh, yeah, you don't need a transplanted organ because you could hypothetically get sorry, you don't, your organ failure is not a claimable condition because you could get an organ transfer. Now, whistleblower called them out on that, and then they threw the book at him. So their entire whistleblower policy was bullshit. And this comes back to the point. It's so easy to lie about ethics. Yeah, remember this, people can lie. In fact, you should probably assume people are lying, especially if they're powerful, and especially when it comes to ethics of all things. Honest people don't need to talk about their ethics, they're just ethical. Anyway, by the by, yes, I appreciate what that implies about me, but either way. Okay. And the point is that unless it's enforced, it doesn't really mean anything. So I mentioned before there was that UN standard, the United Nations Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. This article goes to great lengths to apply these standards to the question of borderline content on social media platforms. Here's your problem. That standard is completely voluntary. So it kind of doesn't exist. People can say they follow it for marketing purposes and then just not follow through. And you can't stop them. No one can stop them. It's not enforced. You can call them out in the media, but I mean, they've got a fair bit more money to throw around than you, assuming they care enough in the first place. And so we have a problem here, right? You cannot deontology your way out of a novel problem. You cannot deontology your way out of any emergent ethical problem, right? So, yeah, a problem. So, what's our alternative? Our alternative, which is what I'm aiming to use in this situation, is consequentialism. Consequentialism measures itself based on the outcomes produced by a given course of action. What you're meant to do is look at a situation for any given specific applied situation. We don't do this in generalities, we do it in specifics. We look at all of the options available to us, or all the reasonable options available to us. Let's not go crazy and have scope creep ruin our day. Then we judge the likely benefits and likely costs of any course of action, or likely benefits, likely harms. And then we go with the one with the maximum benefit and the minimum harm, right? Some of you may have heard as consequentialism or utilitarianism defined as the greatest good for the greatest number. No, that's a bad definition because it enables just prioritizing the majority over the minorities. No, it must be maximum benefit, minimum cost, which you will note leads to one ethical course of action. Deontology permits anything that fits inside the rules. That's its nature. Consequentialism is far more rigorous. It requires only the only ethical course of action is the one with the maximum benefit and the minimum costs. It's very rigorous in that regard. Beneficially, however, it also lines up all the other options in rankings below it. Next least, second most benefit and minimum cost, third, fourth, fifth, and so forth, which means that if the first one fails, you've got fallback options, for example. Anyway, by the by, it also helps you prioritize your approaches. So, what we're looking at here, and its benefit again is that it's incredibly flexible and contextual. So, yeah, aliens can land in the middle of the MCG during the a draw at the AFL Grand Final, and consequentialism can still function. It just has to take into account the available information to make these calculations. However, problem, it cannot be codified because it's so contextual. It's more of a method, right? It's not a stance or a principle or an outcome in and of itself. Taken out of context, codified as a method, it's just a calculation with no numbers. X plus Y equals Z. That means nothing. We need to add numbers in, don't we? So it can't be codified, which means that it either gets used in the context, which is what I'm attempting to do with this PhD, and then you can develop codes out the back of it or a deontological standard at the back of it, which is what I'm aiming to do. So, sounds like the ideal way forward in terms of this PhD. How would I use consequentialism? Well, it's simple. I'm going to look, we start from the objective of preventing extremists promoting their ideas and accomplishing political power online using the variety of methods they do. And then we look at ways of preventing that with the maximum benefit and the minimum cost. That minimum cost in particular, maximum benefit's clear, disruption and removal of these groups from the public sphere or communication on social media. I don't mind if they go underground. It doesn't matter to me, whatever. Like the problem here is that they're normalizing their beliefs and they do that in the public sphere. If they have to run off to 4chan or if they have to go onto private messaging platforms, they're not reaching normies, so to speak. They're not reaching the mainstream, which massively hampers their ability to recruit. That's fine with me. I'll leave it to the intelligence communities to pursue them from there if they deem it necessary. But really, since 90% of the danger of these groups is the political normalization and seizure of power, everything else is fine. So, the cost, on the other hand, minimizing that risk, that's the game. Because while it's possible to, like the benefit, there's a million ways that you can interfere with these groups, disrupt them, and get them off social media, and not least of which just banning anyone who says certain phrases, something that's been attempted before on social media and has ended very badly. Rather, what we need to do here is to minimize that harm. We do not want to infringe on their human right to freedom of speech any more than is strictly necessary or beneficial, right? Starting to get back into the deontology a little bit there, but because we're judging on a contextual basis, it's different. So, where's the weakness? This is my preferred approach to ethics. It's very good. It pretty much always generates, by its definition, generates the best possible way forward in any given circumstance. So what's the problem? There's a lot. The big, fat problem with consequentialism is that it is super prone to abuse. So going back to that speeding example, perfect example, right? Yeah, the rule's clear. The law is clear. You have very easy means of determining whether you're speeding or not, but you still do it. Don't try and tell me otherwise, you liar. Even if you've done it unintentionally, everyone speeds all the time, quite frequently, in fact. Why? Because in that situation, you don't do it all the time. So, even more of a question of why sometimes. I mean, if you're doing it all the time as a principled stance, that's stupid, but it's also a deontological stance. I value my freedom over I value safety of everyone around me. Yeah. Anyway, sorry, I've been reading a lot about sovereign citizens recently. It's infuriating. Yeah. Anyway, yeah. So you breached the law, right? Why? Because in the situation where you were doing it, you looked around you. There's no cops, so the chance of getting caught is pretty slim. You're not going to do it near any speed cameras you know of, so there's that out as well. You're a good driver and you're not going to go that much over the speed limit. You're not going to go 100, like 20, 30 Ks over the speed limit, right? No, that's too dangerous, right? Too risky. You're going to go maybe 8 or 9. And then even if you get caught, you're under 10 Ks over the limit. So yeah, it's not that bad. And all for the benefit of getting to where you need to go a bit faster. You judge this worthy. You reject the rule because fundamentally the rule is just something we made up to guide behavior. Are you right? Well, hard to tell, isn't it? Because it's risk-based. But put it like this, literally everyone who's crashed their car in those circumstances thought they were a good enough driver to handle it. And pretty much everyone, well, literally everyone who's ever gotten a fine has definitely thought they weren't going to. Like that's why else would you do it, right? The point is that humans are terrible at this, and we're very good at rationalizing what we want rather than what is actually true. Yeah, and considering all of the different factors. Now, I said there's only two forms of ethics before. There are variations of consequentialism as well. You got utilitarianism, you got feminist care ethics, but fundamentally, these are all just different versions of don't screw it up. Feminist care ethics, in particular, is a really good one in this context because feminist care ethics basically says, yeah, consequentialism, but bear in mind that you're a white man or that the institution making the decision is probably patriarchal. Therefore, it's a correction. It's saying that don't make the mistake that so many have made in the past of assuming that your calculation of the correct course forwards is entirely rational and fully informed when you haven't even begin to think about the impacts on non-powerless groups like women or people of color, poor people. You see this all the time. People like, I don't think I've ever met a board of directors or a CEO who thought that they were out to get poor people. They just do because they never talk to any. Because why the hell would they do that? Make them feel bad. No, I'm not very sympathetic. I had to sit around with the whole Banking Royal Commission cleanup. Oh my God, unbelievable. Most people. Anyway, by the by, I'll get to that another day. So, super prone to abuse, which means that rigor is vital. Transparency is vital. Accountability, by which I mean actual, practical, like tangible accountability on the people making the decision is essential, which is why I intend to set up an accountability body. Mind you, I'm also reporting directly to the university and want to get my PhD if I screw this up badly enough. So there's a bit of accountability too. When I say tangible, I mean I have something to lose. Literally, I will suffer or experience loss if I fail and don't correct my course. Something you'll notice nearly every group that says that they're valuing accountability does not submit themselves to. Politicians in particular, I remember my rant last week about setting up a sewage treatment plant in the middle of your house. They can do that. And also, you can't stop them. Stopping them would involve material, tactile consequences for the people involved, either through loss of money, loss of autonomy, going to prison, or some equivalent thereof. Worst thing that ever happens to a politician in this country is they get voted out. No, they lose their job. Suppose they'll just have to make do with that cushy position that they were corrupt to get in the first place, and then the pension as well. So, transparency and accountability are absolutely vital. Because again, unfortunately, well, a lot of what I'm describing here isn't actually intentional. A lot of it's subconscious. You just assume you know enough about the situation. There's a classic. Google had this thing. They got a AI in that was automatically classifying pictures on your phone, putting them into folders for you for fun, little review. And it automatically classified several photos of black people as gorillas. Did they do that intentionally? I would be absolutely gobsmacked if that was the case. I'm not going to sit here and pretend Google's a good company or one of the good ones, but like it's not good for their shares, that's for sure. It's not good for their PR. So why the hell they? No, they wouldn't do that. However, it still happened, and I'll go ahead and assume it was because no one thought to check that because none of them are black people. Just an assumption, but no doubt part of the thing. Something that people from marginalized communities will often know to check for because they've been subject to it before. Anyway, it's also vastly worsened by power dynamics. As I mentioned before, the more powerful you are, the less likely you are to be held accountable. This is something we'll talk about next week when I talk about power dynamics again, because that's pretty damn relevant here as well. So, there are major weaknesses to a consequentialist approach. It is, I'm going to be blunt, the only method we can use to solve this problem because it's too novel, it's too emergent, it's changing too rapidly. New technologies, new contexts, new political environments. I mean, the US turning the way it is, again, a major motivator for me doing this PhD. Prior to that, you're really that worried about a bunch of neo-Nazis? But they've seized power in the US and now they're attempting to do it here, and there's funding and political support coming in from overseas. Again, keep an eye on One Nation. That's why they're popular all of a sudden. Big money coming in here to support them as a basically de facto branch of Trump-style U.S. politics. They tried it with Dutton. He screwed it up. Well, Trump screwed it up for him, more accurately. They're not going to stop. Why would they stop? They'll attempt to import this everywhere. Brexit, similar. Nigel Farage, same thing. It's a coordinated effort. That's why this is important. Because if they get political legitimacy and power, well, I know I've been harping on about it, but I'll harp on it once again. They'll kill a third of the state. That's the game, people. They're neo-Nazis. Why would they call themselves that if not to enact the policies of the Nazis? Anyway, so that's where we're at. Ethical rundown. This is why we're using these two different methods. This is vitally important, and it will be vitally important going forward. Though, as you can see, the weaknesses of a consequential method mean that this is going to be very slippery to pin down, but it can be done. In fact, you do it all the time. This is actually how people tend to make decisions. Deontology is how we pretend to make decisions. That's why conversations with lawyers are so frustrating a lot of the time, is because it's like, well, we better per the statutes X, Y, Z, and A, B, C, and D. And I'm sitting there going, I don't give a shit. They're Nazis. Get rid of them. Or, economists, or anyone else who sticks to a strong framework for thinking can be very frustrating because it's not about the framework. The framework's meant to serve our interests. We're not meant to serve the framework. Yeah. Well, major diversion here, but like this is the whole cost of living thing, right? People go on about, oh, well, we can't do X and Y because Z and D and blah, 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 blah. It's like, oh, we're in inflation. And we've got to keep spending down and we've got to keep the growth going up and balance all these systems. Food's too expensive. I can't afford food. I don't give a shit what's happening with the broader economy. If I can't eat properly and I can't get shelter, housing crisis, the economy's failing. I don't care if I can afford a smartphone or not, if I can't eat and can't get shelter. This is the undermining of the social contract that's at the heart of this entire extremism thing. You get right down to it. Like, yes, I'm sure there's very complex reasons why things are the way they are. And yes, I'm sure it's very complicated to solve properly. I don't care. Fix it. It's as simple as that until it's fixed. Again, I don't really, any number of extreme measures are justifiable when it comes down to, in the case of social contract and cost of living and so forth, not being able to eat or not being able to get shelter. Or in the case of extremism, just about anything's justifiable when the alternative is a political group attempting to come to power that will then commit genocide internally. Can't really do a lot worse than that. So, anyway, some context, some ethics. We'll get there. There's a lot to take into consideration. Actually, while I'm here, I might as well go through a few factors. So, yeah. So, in terms of those consequentialist considerations, things that all need to be taken into account. Minimizing that harm will come down to scope. We want to affect as few people as necessary. Especially when it comes to banning or removing content, we want to do that as little as possible, only as when necessary. I'm imagining that will focus primarily on leadership and not on your followers. Severity, we need to minimize how deeply those rights are affected. So remove as little content as possible, only when it's necessary to do it or sufficiently beneficial. Time frame, we want to minimize how long their rights are affected for. So if you can divert people or like help people recover from the movement, then you don't need to impinge on the rights for as long. Clarity, overlap with existing legal frameworks. Doesn't have to be perfectly the same, but as minimal disruption as possible with legal frameworks would be very helpful. We're going to keep it to online only. It's a unique context. It does justify an unusual, as many of the articles have been putting. Social media is a different context, like limiting people's freedom of speech in person, like person to person. That's different because it's really there's a limited scope of how many people you can affect and how intense you can get. Because the unfortunate thing when it comes to freedom of speech is that it's usually limited by the fact that your audience can just punch you. If you say the wrong things, like ethnic slurs, for example, amongst other things, in real life, you're liable to get hit. And that's the real limitation of freedom of speech in practice. We'll pretend it isn't, but it is. Online, that doesn't apply. And you can reach an enormous volume of people. You can do it in an automated fashion, bulk exposure, and virtually zero accountability. This is a problem. Public facing spaces only, as well. As I said before, we're not going to bother with peer-to-peer communications. One, we can't. There's nothing you can do about that without some pretty hefty legislation to back you up, or every one of those companies basically destroying their own business case. So yeah. Also, if they dive into the dark net or something like that, well, I don't care. They're not publicly visible. That makes recruitment virtually impossible. Whatevs. In terms of maximizing the benefits, it's going to come down to impact. So we're prioritizing the most harmful ideas, hence the focus on sovereign citizens, National Socialist networks, or neo-Nazis and ISIS, or extreme Islamic extremists. Those are pretty straightforward. Again, that ethical threshold is going to be high. So removing those from the public sphere is clearly beneficial. There's really no downside. Berger's definition of extremism helps a lot here because, by his definition, these groups don't just have extreme ideas of where they want to take society, like the libertarians, for example. Idiots. It's, I wrote a whole article on it. You can look it up. Um, and I'll do it another time. No, we're not talking about an extreme vision for society. What we're looking at is a group whose existence depends on conflict with outgroups, meaning that as long as they're active and the more active they become, the more conflict there will be. Basically, too dangerous to exist, frankly. Power concentration, we're going to prioritize those causing the most harm, both individuals and as groups, and therefore the greatest benefit per target. So prioritizing based on imminent threat, ascendant, well-funded, and significant. Hence the focus on neo-Nazis. Sovereign citizens are a little ascendant at the moment, thanks to several recent big interactions in the COVID days and all that sort of business. Islamists, less so, though the kickoff with Iran and the destabilization of the Middle East might see some resurgency there. Bondi obviously brought it a little bit back into focus, but they have been quite quiet for a long time, which does tend to imply the disruption methods that have been used to date have been pretty successful. You will note that has largely involved kicking them off any sort of social media. Yeah, so power concentration. We'll look at the individuals, so leadership, super spreaders of information and recruitment, the financial beneficiaries, as well as those that fund them. Systemic. So we're going to identify sources of the problem where we can. Bad faith beneficiaries, funders, and other enabling and motivating factors. Yeah, keep that within scope. It's going to be challenging because we can't go into the sociological causes of this problem in the first place. I can't fix housing affordability on my own. I've got ideas of how it can be done. Like I said before, it should be outcomes focused, not means focused. I don't care how much money you pour into the housing industry. If it doesn't work, it didn't work. And we're going to look at constructive methods wherever possible. So the obvious go-to is banning. I think I mentioned that earlier on, but that is an extreme tactic. Proportionality, right? We're going to use the most constructive means of disruption possible while still accomplishing the goal of disrupting recruitment and propagation of these ideas online, right? So I'm thinking of this at the current time in three levels. I'm calling it the three Ds. Lowest level for your initiates and people that are being suckered into these movements. Diversion. Divert them onto existing services and programs and other supports that will address why they're interested in these groups in the first place. This is as constructive as we can get, addressing the problem at its source using existing resources. Shouldn't be a problem. Next leveled up, your hard-boiled members who are not going to be receptive to that sort of thing. Disruption. Basically, messing with their ability to cohere as a group, to communicate as a group, and to coordinate and further recruitment. I've got some very interesting ideas about that using the in-group prototype that I may have mentioned on here before, but yeah, that could get fun. But finally, for your leadership, for the people that are at the top of the hierarchy of these organizations who are super spreaders of information or who make money off of the organization, decapitation, metaphorically. Those are your bands. To the point of, and yes, they'll just reincarnate their profile. That's fine. But that's what the AI is for. The AI up until this point is just automated counter messaging and provision of services and so forth, pre-bunking, a whole bunch of other useful stuff. When it comes to decapitation, it will become more of a question of training the AI to recognize when the leader's profile pops back up and starts a similar pattern of behavior and bans that one too, basically following them around. If an alternative leader pops up to fill that space and it's not even the same person, doesn't matter, similar source of behavior, you're leading the organization, you get banned. Now, again, this is why there's such a highly ethical threshold on this, because this is going to have to be some pretty heinous stuff. But combine these three factors together, and I think that's the India movement. Where did I get these ideas, incidentally? Because they've been doing it to the green groups for years. Geez, you ought to see what they do to the socialists in particular. Asia inserted itself into one of the environmental groups back in the day. That was absolutely bloody fascinating, but either way. So these are not untried or untested methods. It's going to be actually quite similar to my awareness of what happened with Islam, radical Islam as well, back in the day, following the in the years after September 11 and all that sort of thing. So no, they certainly weren't proportional, but either way, weren't even necessary. But they were pretty hard on that. So that's where we're at. Week 11. Next week, barring anything else coming up, I'll probably have a bit of a dip into the power dynamic side of things, which is a bit more of a thorough topic. I've got a slideshow for that one. But yeah, more to come.